That winter was particularly harsh in Millfield. Not just because of the biting cold that crept through the cracks of poorly insulated homes, but because it was the winter the steel plant closed. For the Johnson family, it was the beginning of the end of life as they knew it. Stephen Johnson sat at the kitchen table watching his father stare vacantly at the layoff notice. The paper trembled slightly in Adam Johnson's calloused hands, hands that had operated machinery at the plant for 15 years, hands that now had nowhere to go. "What does it say, Dad?" Stephen asked, though at 17 he was old enough to understand. Adam folded the paper carefully, as if preserving evidence of a crime. "Plants closing for good. Moving operations overseas." His voice was flat, emotionless. The shock hadn't fully registered yet. Monica Johnson placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. At 41, she looked older than her years, her face lined with the strain of making ends meet. She worked as an orderly at Millfield Memorial Hospital, but her income alone wouldn't be enough to support a family of 5. "We'll figure something out," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We always do." Stephen looked at his 2 younger brothers. Ethan, 10, was busy with homework at the other end of the table, blissfully unaware of the financial guillotine that had just dropped. Mark, 14, caught Stephen's eye, and Stephen knew his brother understood. The family had always struggled, even with both parents working. Now they would truly know what it meant to be poor. The following month saw a mass exodus from Millfield. Families packed up and left for bigger cities with more opportunities. But the Johnsons stayed. They had nowhere else to go, no savings to fund a move. Adam tried to find work as a mechanic, but in a town where everyone was leaving, few people needed their cars fixed. Stephen watched his father diminish before his eyes. Each morning, Adam would leave the house in search of work, and each evening he would return, shoulders slumped in defeat. He spoke less and less, retreating into himself. Monica took on extra shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted, with barely enough energy to prepare dinner before collapsing into bed. The family's financial situation grew increasingly dire. Bill collectors called constantly. The electricity was shut off twice before relatives helped pay the overdue amounts. They relied more and more on Monica's sister, Carmen, who had inherited the lion's share of their grandfather's real estate portfolio. The arrangement was supposed to be that Carmen would manage the properties and share the profits with her siblings. But over time, the sharing had dwindled to occasional dinner invitations and condescending offers of hand-me-downs for the boys. For Stephen, the worst part was the shame. In a small town like Millfield, everyone knew everyone else's business. His classmates knew his father was unemployed. They knew his family was struggling. Some were kind about it, but others weren't. "Nice shirt, Johnson," sneered Brad Collins, the son of the town's only dentist, as Stephen walked into English class one morning. "My dad threw that one out like 3 years ago." Stephen looked down at the faded polo shirt he was wearing. It had belonged to his Uncle Rick, Carmen's husband. The colour had washed out, and it hung loosely on Stephen's lanky frame, but it was clean and intact. He should have been grateful. Instead, he felt a burning in his chest, a mixture of shame and anger that seemed to be his constant companion these days. "At least I don't have to buy my friends," Stephen retorted, referring to the way Brad always seemed to have a crowd around him when he was handing out candy or showing off his latest gadget. The comment earned him a shove into the lockers after class, but Stephen didn't care. What was one more bruise when his pride was already black and blue? After school, Stephen often scoured the neighbourhood for discarded items he could sell. An old bicycle wheel, a lamp missing its shade, a stack of comic books left out for the garbage collector. He'd clean them up and sell them at the weekend flea market. It wasn't much, a few dollars here and there, but it was enough to buy small treats for his brothers, and occasionally for himself. One hot summer day, as Ethan licked an ice cream cone purchased with Stephen's flea market earnings, he looked up at his older brother with sticky-faced gratitude. "You're the best, Stevie," he said, his face a mess of chocolate and vanilla. "Way better than Dad." Stephen felt a pang of guilt. Don't say that, E. Dad's trying his best. But he never gets us anything anymore, Ethan protested. Mum says we can't afford it. Stephen ruffled his little brother's hair. Things will get better. You'll see. But as the months wore on, there was little evidence to support Stephen's optimism. It was a crisp autumn day when the Johnson family piled into their aging sedan to visit Aunt Carmen. These monthly dinners had become a ritual, a humiliating reminder of their dependence on Carmen's charity. Carmen lived across town in a sprawling colonial with pristine white columns and a manicured lawn. Her husband, Rick, was a successful investment banker who commuted to the city. They had no children, which Carmen often pointed out was a blessing given the current economic climate. As they entered the house, Stephen couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between Carmen's home and their own. Plush carpets instead of worn linoleum, gleaming stainless steel appliances instead of a stove with 2 broken burners, art on the walls instead of water stains. Monica, Adam, boys, welcome. Carmen greeted them with air kisses, her diamond earrings catching the light. Dinner's almost ready. Rick's in the study on a call, but he'll join us shortly. The adults moved to the kitchen, leaving Stephen and his brothers in the living room. Mark immediately reached for the remote control, turning on Carmen's massive flat-screen TV. Ethan plopped down on the sofa, bouncing experimentally on the plush cushions. Stephen wandered around, examining the knickknacks and photos that adorned the shelves. There was Carmen and Rick in Paris, standing in front of the Eiffel Tower. Carmen receiving some sort of award at a charity gala. Carmen and Rick on a yacht, sunglasses on, champagne flutes in hand. Stephen's attention was drawn to Carmen's purse, casually tossed on an accent table near the entryway. It was unzipped, and he could see the edge of her wallet peeking out. He glanced toward the kitchen, where he could hear his mother and aunt chatting. His father's low murmur occasionally punctuated their conversation. Without fully realizing what he was doing, Stephen moved closer to the purse. He told himself he was just curious. What did a rich person carry in their wallet? How much cash did someone like Carmen have on hand? He reached out, hesitating for just a moment before carefully sliding the wallet from the purse. He opened it, and his eyes widened at the sight of several $100 bills, neatly folded in the billfold section. This was more money than he'd ever seen in one place, more money than his family had in their checking account right now. Money that Carmen probably wouldn't even miss. An idea formed in Stephen's mind, dangerous, tempting. What if he took just one bill? Just $100? Carmen had so many, surely she wouldn't notice. And he could do so much with that money. He could buy Ethan that action figure he'd been begging for. He could get Mark those basketball shoes he needed for tryouts. He could even help with the electricity bill that was past due again. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, Carmen's wallet in his hands, morality wrestling with necessity in his mind. "Stephen!" his mother's voice called from the kitchen. "Come help set the table." Quickly, Stephen pulled out a single $100 bill, shoved it deep into his pocket, and returned the wallet to the purse. He arranged it exactly as he'd found it, then hurried to the kitchen, his face flushed with a mixture of guilt and exhilaration. Throughout dinner, Stephen barely tasted the pot roast, a cut of meat his family hadn't been able to afford in months. He kept expecting Carmen to notice the missing money, to stand up and point an accusing finger at him. But she didn't. She just continued to talk about her recent vacation to Barbados and how simply exhausting it was to manage so many rental properties. Monica nodded politely, though Stephen could see the strain in her smile. Adam sat silently, pushing food around his plate, a ghost of the man he once was. By the time they left Carmen's house, Stephen had almost convinced himself that what he'd done wasn't really stealing. It was redistribution. A small act of justice in an unjust world. Carmen owed his mother money anyway, money from their grandfather's estate that she'd never shared. The following day, Stephen went to the mall and bought the action figure Ethan had been coveting, a limited edition superhero with light-up features and interchangeable weapons. It cost $45, an amount that would have been unthinkable before. He bought it without hesitation, justifying the purchase with the joy it would bring his little brother. He spent another $30 on a pair of second-hand basketball shoes for Mark. Not the brand new ones his brother wanted, but a decent pair that would at least get him through tryouts without embarrassment. The remaining $25 he tucked away, telling himself it was for emergencies. Deep down, though, he knew he was saving it for the next time his mother's face crumpled when she opened a bill they couldn't pay. When Stephen presented Ethan with the action figure, the boy's face lit up with a joy so pure it almost washed away Stephen's guilt. For real, Stevie? For me? Ethan clutched the toy to his chest, eyes wide with disbelief. Yeah, Squirt. All yours. Stephen ruffled his brother's hair. But listen, this is our secret, okay? Don't tell Mom and Dad just yet. It's a surprise. Ethan nodded solemnly, though Stephen doubted a 10-year-old could keep such an exciting secret for long. He hoped that by the time the toy was discovered, enough time would have passed that no connection would be made to their visit to Carmen's house. Mark was more suspicious when Stephen handed him the shoebox containing the basketball shoes. "Where'd you get the money for these?" he asked, examining the shoes with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. "Been saving up from the flea market," Stephen lied. "Try them on." Mark did, a small smile forming as he laced up the shoes. "They're perfect. Thanks, man." Stephen nodded, pushing down the unease that threatened to engulf him. It was worth it, he told himself. The happiness on his brothers' faces was worth the weight on his conscience. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially in families where space is tight and privacy is a luxury none of them could afford. 3 days after their visit to Carmen's house, Stephen returned home from school to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table, an expression of barely contained fury on her face. Ethan sat across from her, tears streaming down his face, the superhero action figure on the table between them. Stephen's stomach dropped. He knew immediately what had happened. "Where did you get the money for this toy?" Monica asked, her voice dangerously calm. Stephen's mind raced, searching for a plausible explanation. "I saved up from the flea market," he said, repeating the lie he'd told Mark. Monica's eyes narrowed. "Ethan says you gave it to him the day after we visited Aunt Carmen. This toy costs $45. I checked." She held up her phone, displaying the toy's listing on a shopping website. "You haven't made $45 at the flea market in the last 3 months combined." Stephen's palms began to sweat. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Tell me you didn't steal this," Monica pressed, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't steal the toy," Stephen said carefully, which was technically true. "That's not what I'm asking. And you know it." Monica stood up, approaching her eldest son. "Stephen Michael Johnson, did you take money from your Aunt Carmen's purse?" The directness of the question left no room for evasion. Stephen looked at his little brother, who was watching the exchange with wide, tearful eyes. He looked at his mother, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He couldn't bring himself to lie to her face. "Just $100, he admitted quietly. "She has so much, Mom. She wouldn't even notice it was gone." Monica closed her eyes as if the sight of her son was too painful to bear. "Go to your room," she said finally. "I need to call your aunt." Stephen retreated to the room he shared with Mark, collapsing onto his bed. He could hear his mother's voice from the kitchen, apologetic and mortified. Then her tone changed to confusion, then shock. 20 minutes later, she called him back to the kitchen. Adam had arrived home from his latest job hunting expedition and sat at the table, his expression unreadable. Mark had joined them, sitting protectively next to Ethan, who had stopped crying but still looked miserable. "Your Aunt Carmen says she's missing $800 from her purse," Monica said, her voice trembling with anger. $800, Stephen. What did you do with the rest of it?" Stephen's jaw dropped. "What? No! I only took 100, I swear." "Then where is the rest of it?" Monica demanded. "Carmen specifically remembers having counted out $900 to pay her housekeeper before we arrived. After we left, there was only 100 left." "I don't know," Stephen protested. I only took one bill, Mom, I swear to God. Don't you dare take the Lord's name in vain in this house, Monica snapped. On top of being a thief, now you're a liar too? I'm not lying. Stephen looked desperately to his father. Dad, you have to believe me. Adam said nothing, his gaze fixed on the tabletop. His silence was worse than any accusation. Your aunt called you a thief, Monica continued, her voice breaking. She said, that's what you get for being poor, children who steal. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was to hear? After everything we've done for you boys, everything we've sacrificed. Mum, please, Stephen began, but Monica cut him off. $800, Stephen, she shouted, her composure finally breaking. Were you planning to run away? Is that what this is about? Because if you want to leave so badly, maybe you should just go. Monica, Adam said quietly, speaking for the first time. That's enough. But Monica was beyond reason. Years of struggling, of humiliation, of watching her husband withdraw into himself while she carried the family on her back. It all came pouring out in a torrent of anger directed at her eldest son. You've brought shame to our family name, she cried, tears streaming down her face. We'd be better off if you were dead instead. The kitchen fell silent. Even Monica seemed shocked by the words that had left her mouth. Ethan began to cry again, and Mark put an arm around him, glaring at their mother. Stephen stood perfectly still, feeling as if he'd been slapped. He'd never seen his mother like this, never heard such venom in her voice. Get out, Monica whispered, unable to meet his eyes. Just get out. I can't look at you right now. Stephen didn't wait to be told twice. He grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door and fled into the gathering darkness. The autumn air bit at his face, or perhaps it was the tears he hadn't realized he was shedding. He walked aimlessly for hours, replaying the scene in his mind. His mother's words echoed in his ears. We'd be better off if you were dead instead. Had she really meant that? Could a mother ever truly wish her child dead? As midnight approached, Stephen found himself at the small playground where he used to take his brothers when they were younger. He sat on a swing, gently rocking back and forth, trying to decide what to do next. He could go home, face his family, try to convince them he was telling the truth about only taking $100. But who would believe him now? His mother had already decided he was a liar, as well as a thief. His father's silence had spoken volumes. Even if they let him stay, things would never be the same. Or he could leave, start fresh somewhere else. He was 17, just a few months shy of his 18th birthday. He had decent grades. He could probably get his GED and find work somewhere. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Stephen made his decision. He would go home one last time, gather his things while everyone was still asleep, and leave Millfield behind. The house was quiet when he returned. He moved silently through the kitchen, pausing only to scribble a brief note. I only took $100. I'm sorry. I love you all. S. In his room, he stuffed clothes, his school ID, and his few personal belongings into his backpack. He emptied his meager savings, $73 from the flea market, plus the remaining $25 from Carmen's 100, into his wallet. It wouldn't get him far, but it would be a start. As he zipped up his backpack, he noticed Mark watching him from his bed, eyes wide in the semi-darkness. You're leaving? Mark whispered. Stephen nodded. I have to. Mum doesn't want me here. She didn't mean it, Mark insisted. She was just angry. Maybe, Stephen conceded, but it's better this way. Take care of Ethan, okay? Mark's eyes filled with tears. Where will you go? I don't know yet, Stephen admitted, but I'll be okay. And someday, when I've figured things out, I'll find you. Promise? Mark's voice was small, childlike. Promise. Stephen held out his pinky, and Mark linked his own with it, a solemn vow between brothers. With one last look around the room that had been his refuge for 17 years, Stephen shouldered his backpack and slipped out the front door into the cold morning air. He didn't look back as he walked to the bus station, purchased a ticket for the furthest destination his money would take him, and boarded the bus that would carry him away from the only life he'd ever known. The bus ride lasted nearly 14 hours with 3 transfers, each taking Stephen further from Millfield. He dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every stop, half expecting to see his father's stern face or hear his mother's angry voice calling him back. But no one came for him. No one called his name. By the time the bus pulled into the final station in the small town of Riverdale, Stephen had come to terms with the reality of his situation. He was alone now, responsible for himself in a way he'd never been before. Riverdale was nothing like Millfield. Where Millfield had been slowly dying since the plant closure, Riverdale hummed with quiet prosperity. The downtown area was small but vibrant, with shops that displayed artisanal goods rather than going out of business signs. Stephen's first priority was finding a place to sleep. The remaining money in his wallet wouldn't get him more than a night or 2 at the cheapest motel. And then what? He needed a job, and fast. He wandered through the town centre, scanning storefronts for help wanted signs. Most businesses seemed fully staffed, or perhaps they were hesitant to hire a dishevelled teenager with no local references. By late afternoon, discouragement had begun to set in. The smell of fresh bread led him to a small bakery tucked between a bookstore and a cafe. The sign above the door read, "Miller's Bakery," in faded gold lettering. Through the window, Stephen could see an elderly man behind the counter, carefully arranging pastries in a display case. On impulse, Stephen pushed open the door, triggering a small bell. The scent of baked goods enveloped him, yeast and sugar and warmth, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since the previous day. "Be right with you, young man," called the elderly baker without looking up from his task. Stephen approached the counter, his mouth watering at the sight of fresh bread loaves, golden croissants, and cookies the size of his palm. "What can I get for you?" the baker asked, finally turning to face his customer. His eyes, kind but shrewd behind wire-rimmed glasses, took in Stephen's rumpled appearance and the backpack slung over his shoulder. "Actually," Stephen began, his voice hoarse from lack of use, "I was wondering if you might be hiring." The baker, Mr. Miller, Stephen presumed, studied him for a long moment. "You have any experience in a bakery?" "No, sir," Stephen admitted, "but I'm a quick learner, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Mr. Miller stroked his white beard thoughtfully. "Where are you from, son?" "You're not local." "Millfield," Stephen answered. "About 14 hours from here by bus." "Millfield?" Mr. Miller's eyebrows rose. "That's steel country. Or it was. Plant closed down recently, didn't it?" Stephen nodded. "Last winter." "Tough break for a lot of families, I imagine," Mr. Miller said. "You got family back there?" Stephen hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Yes, sir, but there wasn't much opportunity left in Millfield." Mr. Miller seemed to sense there was more to the story but didn't press. "Well, as it happens, my wife and I could use an extra pair of hands around here. Nothing fancy to start. Cleaning, deliveries, that sort of thing. But if you're interested in learning the trade, I could teach you a thing or 2. Relief washed over Stephen. "I'm very interested, sir. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mr. Miller cautioned with a small smile. "The pay's not much and the hours are long. We start at 4 in the morning to get the day's bread ready. Think you can handle that?" "Yes, sir," Stephen said firmly. "When can I start?" "Tomorrow morning," Mr. Miller replied. 4 o'clock sharp. And one more thing, you got a place to stay." Stephen's hesitation answered the question. Mr. Miller sighed. "There's a room above the bakery. Nothing fancy, mind you. Used to be storage until our son went off to college. He never came back. Got a fancy job in the city instead." There was a touch of old sorrow in his voice. "You can stay there for now until you get on your feet. Rent will come out of your wages." Stephen couldn't believe his luck. A job and a place to stay all in one afternoon. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll be on time tomorrow," Mr. Miller replied gruffly, though his eyes were kind. "And call me Joe. Mr. Miller makes me feel older than I already am. As Joe showed Stephen to the small room above the bakery, Stephen felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Here was a chance to start fresh, to prove himself, to become someone his family might be proud of, if they ever saw him again. The room was sparse but clean. A twin bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with 3 drawers, a small desk under the window, and a bookshelf containing a mix of novels and baking texts. A tiny bathroom with a shower stall completed the space. "It's not much," Joe apologized, "but it's private. My wife Eleanor and I live in the house behind the bakery. You'll meet her tomorrow." "It's perfect," Stephen said sincerely. After sharing a room with Mark his entire life, the idea of having his own space, however small, felt like luxury. After Joe left, Stephen sat on the edge of the bed, taking stock of his situation. He was far from home, with only a few dollars to his name, starting a job he knew nothing about. Yet, for the first time in months, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Here, no one knew him as the thief, the disappointment, the son his mother wished was dead. Here, he could be anyone he wanted to be. He made a silent promise to himself. He would work harder than anyone expected, learn everything Joe was willing to teach him, and never give anyone reason to doubt his honesty or his worth again. The next morning, Stephen's alarm went off at 3:30 a.m. For a disorienting moment, he didn't know where he was. Then the events of the past few days came rushing back, and he pulled himself out of bed, determined to make a good impression on his first day. He arrived in the bakery kitchen at 3:55, finding Joe already there, tying an apron around his waist. A petite woman with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes stood next to him, mixing something in a large bowl. "Ah, Stephen," Joe said, looking pleased. "Right on time. This is my wife, Eleanor." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and extended one to Stephen. "It's lovely to meet you, dear. Joe told me about you. We're happy to have the help." Her warmth was so genuine, so reminiscent of how his own mother used to be before life had hardened her, that Stephen felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you for having me, Mom. I'm eager to learn." "Oh, none of that Mom business," Eleanor chuckled. "It's Ellie to everyone except the tax collector." The first day was exhausting. Stephen swept floors, washed countless bowls and baking sheets, carried bags of flour from the storeroom, and made deliveries to local cafes and restaurants. By the time the bakery closed at 6 p.m., every muscle in his body ached. But there was satisfaction in the ache. He'd worked hard, earned his keep, and even received a few words of praise from Joe for his attention to detail. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Stephen settled into a routine. He was up before dawn, working alongside Joe and Ellie, learning the rhythms of the bakery. In the beginning, his tasks were simple: mixing basic doughs, shaping loaves under Joe's watchful eye, operating the massive mixers that occupied one corner of the kitchen. Gradually, Joe entrusted him with more complex responsibilities. By the 6-month mark, Stephen could prepare a perfect batch of croissants, the layers of butter and dough creating a pastry that customers drove miles to purchase. By the end of his first year, he was experimenting with his own recipes, to Joe and Ellie's delight. "The boy has a gift," Joe told his wife one evening, not realizing Stephen could hear them from the stairway. "Better instincts than our Thomas ever had." "Don't say that," Ellie scolded gently. "Thomas just had different dreams." I know, Joe sighed. "I just wish. Well, no use dwelling on what might have been. Stephen's been a blessing, hasn't he?" "That he has," Ellie agreed warmly. "That he has." Stephen retreated to his room, a complex mix of emotions swirling in his chest: pride at Joe's praise, guilt at the thought of replacing their son in their affections, and a deep, persistent ache for his own family, the parents and brothers he hadn't spoken to in over a year. He'd thought about contacting them, especially Mark and Ethan. But what would he say? How could he explain his abrupt departure, his long silence? And what if they didn't want to hear from him? What if his mother still wished he'd never been born? So he poured himself into his work instead, channeling his emotions into creating the perfect loaf, the most delicate pastry, the richest chocolate cake. The bakery thrived under the combined efforts of Joe, Ellie, and their young apprentice. Customers commented on the new energy in the old bakery, the innovative offerings alongside the traditional favourites. Stephen used his earnings to take night classes at the local community college, studying business management. He was determined to make something of himself, to build a future secure enough that he'd never be tempted to steal again, never have to worry about providing for those he loved. As his second year in Riverdale began, Stephen noticed subtle changes in Joe and Ellie. They tired more easily. Joe's hands, once steady as he decorated intricate cakes, now sometimes trembled. Ellie, who had always been the first to arrive in the kitchen, occasionally overslept. "It's nothing," Joe insisted when Stephen expressed concern. "Just getting older, that's all." But Stephen knew it was more than that. He took on additional responsibilities without being asked, arriving earlier to prepare the doughs, staying later to clean up. He rearranged the kitchen to minimize the distance Joe and Ellie had to walk between tasks. He hired a local teenager to handle deliveries, freeing himself to spend more time in the kitchen where the aging couple needed him most. One cold winter morning, as Stephen shaped baguettes for the day's baking, Joe cleared his throat nervously. "Stephen, my boy, Ellie and I need to talk to you about something important." Stephen looked up, alarmed by the serious tone. "Is everything okay?" "Yes and no," Joe said, glancing at his wife. "The truth is, we're not as young as we used to be. The doctor says Ellie's arthritis is getting worse, and my heart, well, it's not what it once was." "We've been thinking about retiring," Ellie continued, her eyes misty. "Moving to Florida, maybe. My sister has a place in a nice retirement community there." Stephen's heart sank. He'd grown to love this bakery, to love Joe and Ellie like the grandparents he'd never really known. The thought of losing them, of possibly having to start over elsewhere, was devastating. "I understand," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've worked hard your whole lives. You deserve to rest." "The thing is," Joe said, "we've been worried about what would happen to the bakery. We built this place from nothing 40 years ago. The thought of selling it to some corporation, or worse, closing it down, it breaks our hearts." "If there's anything I can do to help with the transition," Stephen began, but Ellie cut him off with a gentle laugh. "Oh, Stephen, you don't understand. We're not selling the bakery. We're giving it to you." Stephen stared at them, certain he'd misheard. "What?" Joe smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "You heard right, son. Miller's Bakery is yours if you want it. We've already talked to our lawyer about the paperwork." "But why?" Stephen stammered. "I mean, I'm grateful, but why me?" "Because you love this place almost as much as we do," Ellie said simply. "Because you have the talent and the drive to make it even better than it is now. And because," her voice caught, "because you've become like a son to us." "We never had children of our own," Joe explained, taking his wife's hand. "Ellie couldn't, and I promised her I'd stay by her side no matter what. Thomas was our nephew, my brother's boy. We took him in when his parents died, raised him as our own. But he never had the passion for baking. He's happy in the city working in finance." "We want this bakery to live on," Ellie added, "and we can't think of better hands to leave it in than yours." Stephen was overwhelmed. This small bakery had been his sanctuary, his fresh start. Now it could be his future. A lump formed in his throat, and he blinked rapidly to clear the moisture from his eyes. "I don't know what to say," he managed finally. "Say yes," Joe encouraged. "Say you'll take our legacy and make it your own." "Yes," Stephen whispered, then more firmly. "Yes, I'd be honoured." The transition happened gradually over the next 6 months. Stephen took on more managerial responsibilities while Joe and Ellie began to step back. They found a lovely condo in a retirement community in Naples, Florida, close to Ellie's sister. The legal paperwork was completed, transferring ownership of Miller's Bakery to Stephen Johnson, who at 20 would become one of the youngest business owners in Riverdale. The night before Joe and Ellie were set to leave for Florida, they hosted a small gathering in the bakery for their closest friends and most loyal customers. Stephen had prepared a spectacular spread of their most popular items, plus a few of his own creations. As the guests mingled, sampling pastries and sharing memories of the bakery through the years, Joe tapped a spoon against his glass to call for attention. "Friends, thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "As you know, tomorrow Ellie and I begin a new chapter in our lives. It's not easy to leave this place after 40 years, but it's time." He gestured to Stephen, who stood nearby. "Some of you may be wondering what will happen to the bakery. I'm pleased to tell you that it will continue under the very capable hands of this young man. Stephen came to us 2 years ago looking for a job. What he found was a vocation, and, if you'll forgive an old man's sentimentality, a family." Ellie wiped a tear from her eye as Joe continued. "We've taught him everything we know, but the truth is, he's taught us a thing or two as well. His passion, his innovation, they've breathed new life into this old bakery." Joe raised his glass. "So please join me in toasting the new owner of Miller's Bakery, though I suspect it won't be called that for much longer." He winked at Stephen. "To Stephen Johnson, and to many more years of the best bread in Riverdale." The crowd echoed the toast, glasses clinking as Stephen stood, overwhelmed by the moment. These people, many of whom had become friends over the past 2 years, were looking at him with genuine warmth and excitement for the future. "Thank you all," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "And especially thank you, Joe and Ellie. You took a chance on me when I had nothing to offer but willing hands and a strong back. You've given me not just a job or even a career, but a home." He swallowed hard. "I promise to honor your legacy while building something you'll be proud to have your name associated with." Later that night, after the guests had departed and the bakery was quiet once more, Joe handed Stephen a small, worn notebook. "Our recipes," he explained. "The original ones, in my grandmother's handwriting. Some of them go back 4 generations." Stephen accepted the notebook with reverent hands. "Joe, I can't take this. It should stay in your family." Joe placed a weathered hand on Stephen's shoulder. "You are family, son. Maybe not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes, that's the stronger bond." The next morning, Stephen drove Joe and Ellie to the airport. The goodbye was tearful but filled with promises of visits and phone calls. As their plane took off, Stephen felt both a profound sadness and an exhilarating sense of possibility. The bakery was his now, his to shape, to grow, to transform. And he had plans, big plans. The first thing Stephen did as the official owner of the bakery was to close for a week of renovations. He'd been saving diligently, living frugally in his small apartment above the shop, and now he invested those savings in modernizing the space while preserving its charm. Fresh paint in warm, inviting colors. New display cases that showed off the baked goods to better advantage. A small seating area with cafe tables where customers could enjoy their purchases with a cup of freshly brewed coffee. When the bakery reopened, it did so under a new name, Rising Dough. The name was a nod to both the baking process and to Stephen's own journey from rock bottom to business owner. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. Customers old and new flocked to see the changes, and most importantly, to confirm that the quality of the baking remained as high as ever. They weren't disappointed. Stephen maintained the classics that had made the bakery a Riverdale institution, while gradually introducing new offerings that reflected his own culinary vision. Chocolate croissants filled with a ganache he'd perfected during late-night experimentation. Artisanal sourdough loaves with a distinctive tang and perfect crust. Seasonal fruit tarts that showcased local produce. Each new item was thoughtfully developed and impeccably executed. Business boomed. Within 6 months, Stephen had to hire 2 additional bakers and a full-time counterperson to keep up with demand. The local newspaper ran a feature on the young entrepreneur who had revitalized a beloved town institution, complete with a photo of Stephen in his flour-dusted apron, standing proudly in front of his shop. He sent a copy of the article to Joe and Ellie in Florida, along with a box of their favorite pastries. Their delighted phone call in response warmed his heart, but it also stirred something deeper, a longing to share his success with his own family. In the quiet hours after the bakery closed, Stephen often found himself thinking about Millfield, about his brothers, who would be 17 and 13 now, about his parents, who had never tried to find him, never reached out. Had they even looked for him? Or had his mother's cruel words been the truth, that they were better off without him? One evening, as Stephen reviewed the day's sales figures, his cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Thinking it might be a supplier, he answered professionally. Rising Dough Bakery, Stephen speaking. There was a pause, then a hesitant voice. Stevie, is that really you? Stephen's heart stopped. Only his family had ever called him Stevie. Mark, he whispered. Yeah, it's me. His brother's voice had deepened in the 3 years since they'd last spoken. I can't believe I finally found you. How? Stephen couldn't form a complete thought, overwhelmed by the sound of his brother's voice. The newspaper article, Mark explained. Someone from Millfield who moved to Riverdale recognized your name and sent it to me. I've been looking for you for years, Stevie. We all have. Stephen gripped the phone tighter. Even Mom? There was a slight hesitation. Yeah, even Mom. She regretted what she said the moment you left. We all knew you hadn't taken that much money. Aunt Carmen eventually admitted she must have miscounted or spent some of it herself. A wave of vindication washed over Stephen, quickly followed by anger that had simmered for years. It took her 3 years to admit that, after accusing me of stealing hundreds of dollars, after Mom said... He couldn't bring himself to repeat the words. I know, Mark said quietly. It was messed up, all of it. But people make mistakes, Stevie. Even parents. Stephen closed his eyes, absorbing his brother's words. How is everyone? How are you and Ethan? We're okay, Mark said. Dad finally found steady work about a year after you left, mechanic at a garage in the next town over. Mom still works at the hospital. Ethan's in high school now, if you can believe it. I'm at community college studying engineering. That's great, Mark. Stephen felt a surge of pride for his brother. You always were good with numbers. Yeah, well, not all of us can be successful bakery owners at 20, Mark teased, but there was genuine admiration in his voice. The article said you've been in Riverdale for 3 years. It killed me to think you were out there all that time and we couldn't find you. I'm sorry, Stephen said, meaning it. I should have reached out, but I was angry and hurt, and then as time passed, it got harder to make that first call. I get it, Mark assured him. But we've found each other now, and that's what matters. He paused. Would it be okay if I came to visit sometime? Maybe bring Ethan. He still has that superhero toy, you know. Keeps it on his shelf like some kind of reminder. Tears pricked at Stephen's eyes. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot. They talked for nearly 2 hours, catching up on 3 years of separation. Mark explained that their parents had searched for Stephen at first, filing a missing persons report and checking homeless shelters in nearby cities. But as months passed with no sign of him, they had begun to lose hope. Mark, however, had never stopped believing that his brother was out there somewhere, making his way in the world. By the time they hung up, plans had been made for Mark and Ethan to visit Riverdale during their upcoming spring break. Stephen would pay for their bus tickets, a fact that filled him with quiet satisfaction. He could provide for his brothers now, legitimately. That night, Stephen slept better than he had in years, as if a weight he hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from his shoulders. The next morning, he woke with a new energy and a clarity of purpose that translated into his work. Over the next few months, as he prepared for his brother's visit, Stephen began to formulate a vision for the future of Rising Dough. The bakery was doing well, very well, but he saw potential for more. What if he could expand? Not just a bigger location in Riverdale, but additional locations in neighboring towns. He began researching, developing a business plan, meeting with the bank about loans. By the time Mark and Ethan arrived for their visit, he had the beginnings of a strategy to transform Rising Dough from a single successful bakery into something much larger. Seeing his brothers again after 3 years was both strange and wonderful. Mark, at 17, was nearly as tall as Stephen now, with the same serious eyes but a more confident bearing than Stephen remembered. Ethan, at 13, was in the awkward throes of early adolescence, all gangly limbs and voice that cracked mid-sentence, but his face lit up with the same unguarded joy when he spotted Stephen waiting at the bus station. "Stevie!" Ethan broke into a run, throwing his arms around his oldest brother with such force that Stephen staggered back a step. "You look different. More grown up." "So do you, Squirt," Stephen laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair, a gesture that earned him an eye roll that was pure teenager. "You're almost as tall as Mark." "Not quite," Mark grinned, stepping forward for his own hug, "but he's getting there." The week that followed was one of the happiest of Stephen's life. He showed his brothers around Riverdale, introduced them to his employees and regular customers, taught them the basics of bread making in the bakery kitchen after hours. He took them to dinner at the best restaurant in town, a far cry from the fast food that had been a rare treat in their childhood. On their last evening together, as they sat in Stephen's apartment above the bakery eating pizza and playing video games like they used to, Mark broached the subject they'd all been avoiding. "Mum and Dad know we're here," he said, setting down his controller. "They wanted to come, but we thought it might be too much all at once." Stephen nodded, keeping his eyes on the screen. "Probably smart." "They miss you, Stevie," Ethan added quietly. "Mom cries sometimes when she thinks nobody's watching. And Dad, he's not the same." Stephen felt a tangle of emotions, longing, resentment, guilt. "I don't know if I'm ready to see them yet," he admitted, "especially Mom." "She was wrong," Mark acknowledged. "What she said that night, it was wrong, and she knows it. But she was under so much pressure back then, trying to keep us all afloat while Dad was—" He trailed off, not wanting to criticize their father. "While Dad was drowning in his own depression," Stephen finished. "I know. I don't blame him for that. And I don't really blame Mom either, not anymore. But some wounds take time to heal." "Just think about it," Ethan pleaded. "Maybe they could visit next time." Stephen looked at his youngest brother's hopeful face and found he couldn't refuse. Maybe. No promises, but maybe. When Mark and Ethan left the next day, Stephen sent them home with boxes of pastries for their parents and a promise to stay in touch. True to his word, he called regularly, gradually rebuilding the relationship with his brothers that had been fractured by his departure. Through these conversations, he learned more about how his family had fared in his absence. His father had eventually pulled himself out of his depression, finding purpose in his new job and in supporting Mark and Ethan through their own challenges. His mother had thrown herself into her work at the hospital, earning promotions that had eased their financial situation somewhat. Aunt Carmen had become even more insufferable after her husband's business took off, but the family saw her less frequently now that they weren't dependent on her charity. As the months passed, Stephen's business continued to thrive. He secured a loan to open a second Rising Dough location in a neighboring town, hiring a manager he trusted to oversee the original bakery while he focused on the expansion. The second location was an immediate success, confirming his belief that his business model had potential beyond Riverdale. By the time Stephen turned 25, Rising Dough had grown to 5 locations across 3 counties, each maintaining the high standards and personal touch that had made the original bakery special. He had moved out of the apartment above the bakery into a modest but comfortable house on the outskirts of Riverdale. He had a small but dedicated corporate team handling the administrative aspects of the business, freeing him to focus on product development and quality control. He had also, with Mark and Ethan's encouragement, begun financially supporting his brothers through college. Mark was completing his engineering degree at a state university, and Ethan was preparing to start pre-med studies, his childhood interest in helping others having evolved into a desire to become a doctor. Stephen took quiet pride in being able to ensure that his brothers wouldn't graduate burdened with student loans, that they could focus on their studies rather than working multiple jobs as he once had. He was particularly careful not to let his parents know about this arrangement, not out of spite, but because he understood their pride might be wounded by the implication that they couldn't provide for their sons. It was Mark who eventually convinced Stephen to consider further expansion. "You've proven the model works in small towns," he pointed out during one of their regular phone calls. "What about cities? What about franchising?" The idea took root in Stephen's mind. Why not? Rising Dough had a distinctive brand, a loyal customer base, and a reputation for quality that set it apart from chain bakeries. With the right partners and careful planning, it could grow far beyond what he'd originally envisioned. Over the next 2 years, Stephen worked tirelessly to transform Rising Dough from a regional success into a national brand. He developed standardized recipes and training programs, ensuring consistency across locations. He refined the visual identity of the bakeries, creating a warm, inviting atmosphere that was recognizable but never felt corporate. He personally vetted potential franchisees, selecting only those who shared his passion for quality and community. By the time he turned 27, Rising Dough had expanded to dozens of locations across multiple states. Stephen had been featured in business magazines as a rising star in the food industry, his story of building a bakery empire from scratch resonating with readers. He'd been invited to speak at conferences, consulted by other entrepreneurs seeking to replicate his success. Through it all, he remained grounded, never forgetting the lessons he'd learned from Joe and Ellie, who watched his success from their retirement with the pride of surrogate parents. He made time to visit each new bakery, to know the names of his employees, to ensure that every loaf and pastry met his exacting standards. And he continued to support his brothers, taking immense satisfaction in their achievements. Mark had graduated with honours and secured a position with an engineering firm. Ethan was thriving in medical school, his compassionate nature perfectly suited to his chosen profession. But despite all his success, there remained a hollow space in Stephen's heart, a space that could only be filled by reconciliation with his parents. He had forgiven them in his heart long ago, understanding that they had been doing their best in impossible circumstances. But he had yet to tell them so, to bridge the gap that had widened with each passing year. As his 30th birthday approached, Stephen found himself increasingly preoccupied with thoughts of his parents. They were getting older. Life was unpredictable. What if something happened before he had the chance to make peace? It was this thought that finally prompted him to reach out, to extend an invitation for them to visit him in Riverdale. Mark acted as intermediary, preparing them for the meeting, assuring them that Stephen wanted reconciliation. And so it was that on a bright spring morning, 10 years after he had fled Millfield in the dark of night, Stephen stood in his office at Rising Dough's headquarters, watching through the window as a modest sedan pulled into the parking lot. His secretary knocked softly on the door. "Mr. Johnson, there's a couple here to see you. They say they're your parents." Stephen took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and prepared to face the past he had both fled from and been shaped by. "Send them in, please, Linda." Monica and Adam Johnson stood awkwardly in the doorway of Stephen's office, both looking older than their years but better than he remembered. His father's hair had gone completely grey, and deep lines bracketed his mouth, but he stood straighter than the defeated man in Stephen's memories. His mother was thinner, her once round face now angular, her hair cut short and practical, but her eyes, the same deep brown as Stephen's own, were clear and alert. For a long moment no one spoke. Stephen had rehearsed this meeting in his mind countless times, but now that it was happening, words failed him. It was his father who finally broke the silence, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Son," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. Stephen took his father's hand, then found himself pulled into a fierce embrace. "Dad," he whispered, the word feeling strange and familiar all at once. When they separated, both men's eyes were suspiciously bright. Stephen turned to his mother, who stood rooted to the spot, her hands clasped tightly before her as if in prayer. "Mom," Stephen said, uncertain how to proceed. Monica's composure crumbled. "Oh, Stevie," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "My boy. My beautiful boy." She moved toward him then, hesitant, as if afraid he might reject her. Stephen met her halfway, wrapping his arms around her slight frame, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his chest. "The things I said, I didn't mean them. I've regretted them every day since." "I know, Mom," Stephen soothed, his own voice unsteady. "It's okay. It's all okay now." They stood like that for what seemed like an eternity, a family fractured and now beginning to heal. Finally, Monica stepped back, wiping her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "Look at you," she said, attempting a watery smile. "All grown up. A businessman." "You've done well for yourself," Adam added, his gaze taking in the tasteful office with its awards and photographs on the walls. "Mark told us, but seeing it, it's something else." Stephen gestured to the sitting area by the window. "Please, sit down. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Tea?" "Coffee would be nice," Monica said, settling onto the leather sofa. "Black for your father, cream and sugar for me." "I remember," Stephen said with a small smile, picking up his desk phone to ask Linda to bring in a coffee service. As they waited, an awkward silence descended again. There was so much to say, so many years to account for, that it was hard to know where to begin. "Your brother says you have bakeries all over the country now," Adam ventured finally. Stephen nodded. 37 locations in 12 states, with more opening this year. It started with one small bakery here in Riverdale, owned by an elderly couple who took a chance on me. "Joe and Ellie Miller," Monica said. "Mark told us about them. They sound like wonderful people." "They are," Stephen agreed. "They gave me a job when I had nothing, a home when I needed one. They taught me everything I know about baking, and then they gave me their business when they retired." He paused, then added quietly, "They're the reason I made it." Monica flinched slightly at the implication that her son had needed to be saved by strangers, but she nodded. "We'd like to meet them someday, to thank them for looking after you when we couldn't." Linda arrived with the coffee, providing a momentary distraction as she set up the service on the low table before them. "Will there be anything else, Mr. Johnson?" she asked. "No, thank you, Linda. Could you hold my calls for the next hour?" "Of course." She smiled politely at Monica and Adam before leaving, closing the door behind her. Stephen poured coffee for his parents, remembering exactly how each of them took it. A small detail from his past life that had somehow remained intact while so much else had changed. "Mark says you're helping him and Ethan with college," Adam said, accepting his cup. That's very generous of you, son." Stephen shrugged. "I can afford it, and I want them to have opportunities I didn't. They're both doing amazing things." "They are," Monica agreed. "But so are you, Stephen. What you've built here, it's incredible." "I had good teachers," Stephen said, "and I got lucky." "It wasn't luck," Adam countered, a hint of his old firmness returning. "It was hard work and talent. Don't sell yourself short." Stephen was surprised by his father's vehemence, by this show of the strength he'd once admired, before watching it crumble under the weight of unemployment and despair. "Your father's right," Monica added. "We've seen the articles about you, about how you built this business from nothing. That wasn't luck. That was you." Stephen felt a warmth spread through his chest at his parents' praise, a feeling he'd longed for as a child but rarely received, especially after the plant closure had cast its long shadow over their family. "Thank you," he said simply. "That means a lot, coming from you both." They sipped their coffee in a silence that was more comfortable now, less strained. Stephen studied his parents over the rim of his cup, noting the signs of aging, of hardship, but also of resilience. They had survived, as he had. "I want you to know," Monica said suddenly, setting her cup down with a decisive clink, "that I never, ever meant what I said that night. About wishing you were—" She couldn't bring herself to repeat the cruel words. "It was the worst thing I've ever said in my life, and I've regretted it every day since. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I didn't mean it. Not for 1 second." Stephen saw the raw pain in his mother's eyes, the decade of guilt she'd carried. "I know, Mom," he said gently. "I knew even then that it was the stress talking, not you. And I do forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago." "You shouldn't have had to," she insisted. "A mother should never say such things to her child, no matter what." "We all make mistakes," Stephen said, thinking of his own theft that had set these events in motion. "And we were all under impossible pressure back then." "That's no excuse," Adam interjected, surprising Stephen again. "Your mother and we were the adults. We should have handled things better." He ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I should have handled things better. Instead, I checked out when you kids needed me most. Left your mother to carry everything. That wasn't fair to any of you." Monica reached over to take her husband's hand. "We were both doing the best we could at the time, Adam. It just wasn't good enough." "No," Adam agreed heavily. "It wasn't." Stephen was moved by his parents' candor, by their willingness to acknowledge their failings without excuses. It was a level of self-awareness he hadn't expected, and it made the reconciliation he'd been hoping for seem suddenly more possible. "We've all grown since then," he offered. "Changed. Become better versions of ourselves, I hope." "You certainly have," Monica said with a tentative smile. "Our son, the CEO." Stephen laughed softly. "Chief Executive Baker is my preferred title, actually." Adam smiled for the first time since arriving, a small, careful smile, but genuine. Always did have a sense of humor, even as a kid. The conversation flowed more easily after that, as they caught each other up on the intervening years. Stephen shared stories of his early days at Miller's Bakery, of learning the trade, of his first attempts at running a business. His parents told him about Millfield's slow recovery as new industries moved in to replace the steel plant, about their own modest improvements in circumstances as Adam found steady work and Monica earned promotions. They avoided the most painful topics by unspoken agreement: Stephen's theft, Monica's cruel words, the long years of separation. There would be time for deeper healing later. For now, it was enough to be in the same room, talking, reconnecting. As their allotted hour drew to a close, Stephen stood. "I'd like to show you around if you have time. The original bakery is just a few blocks from here. And then maybe dinner. I know a great restaurant in town." "We'd like that," Adam said, standing as well. "We're here until tomorrow afternoon." "Where are you staying?" Stephen asked, suddenly worried that they might have booked a cheap motel to save money, a habit from harder times. "The Riverdale Inn," Monica answered. "Mark made the reservation for us. It seems very nice." Stephen nodded, relieved. The inn was comfortable and well-maintained, if not luxurious. "Perfect. Let me just grab my jacket, and we can head out." As they walked through the Rising Dough headquarters, Stephen introduced his parents to key staff members they encountered. He showed them the test kitchen where new products were developed, the training center where franchisees learned the Rising Dough methods, the wall of photographs documenting the company's growth from a single storefront to a national brand. His parents' obvious pride as they took it all in was balm to a wound Stephen hadn't realized was still open. Their approval, their recognition of what he had accomplished, it meant more than he had expected. The tour of the original bakery was equally meaningful. Stephen had preserved much of Joe and Ellie's original charm while updating the space to reflect the Rising Dough brand. The same wooden countertops where he had learned to shape bread dough were still in use. The ancient mixer that had given him so much trouble as a novice baker still occupied its corner, though it was now more decorative than functional. "This is where it all began," Stephen explained, running his hand along the worn countertop. "Joe taught me to make my first loaf right here." Monica looked around the kitchen with misty eyes. "It's a lovely space. I can see why you fell in love with baking here." "Joe and Ellie sound like remarkable people," Adam added. "Taking in a strange kid, teaching him a trade, giving him a chance." "They are," Stephen agreed. "They're in Florida now, but we talk every week. They like to say they have bakeries all over the country, even though they're retired." "In a way they do," Monica said softly. "Through you." Stephen nodded, unable to speak past the sudden lump in his throat. His mother had always had a gift for seeing to the heart of things when she wasn't blinded by stress and worry. Dinner that evening was at Riverdale's finest restaurant, a farm-to-table establishment where Stephen was greeted by name and shown to the best table. He ordered wine, a luxury his parents rarely indulged in, and encouraged them to choose whatever they wanted from the menu, regardless of price. As they enjoyed their meal, the conversation turned to the future. "Mark mentioned you might be thinking of expanding internationally," Adam said, clearly proud to be discussing his son's business empire. Stephen nodded. "We're looking at Canada first, then possibly the UK. The logistics are complicated, but the demand is there." "And what about your personal life?" Monica asked tentatively. "Mark says there's a young lady." Stephen smiled, thinking of Olivia, the graphic designer who had created Rising Dough's distinctive logo and branding 3 years ago. What had begun as a professional relationship had gradually evolved into something deeper. "Her name is Olivia Chen. We've been together for about 3 years now." "That's wonderful," Monica said, clearly delighted. "Will we get to meet her?" "She's out of town at a conference this week," Stephen explained, "but next time you visit, and I hope there will be a next time, I'd love for you to meet her." "We'd like that," Adam said. "Very much." As dinner concluded and they prepared to leave, Stephen felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The reunion hadn't been perfect. There were still unspoken hurts, still bridges to be rebuilt, but it was a beginning. A good beginning. Outside the restaurant, as they waited for the valet to bring around Stephen's car, Monica touched his arm. "There's one more thing, Stephen," she said, her expression serious again. "Your Aunt Carmen." Stephen stiffened at the mention of his aunt. Despite his reconciliation with his parents, he had never quite forgiven Carmen for her role in the events that had driven him from home. "What about her?" "She heard about your success," Monica explained. "Mark didn't tell her, but you know how small towns are. Word gets around." "And let me guess," Stephen said, his voice cooling. "Now she wants to reconnect with her successful nephew?" Monica nodded, looking uncomfortable. "She's been asking for your contact information. We haven't given it to her," she added quickly. "That's your decision, but I thought you should know." "Thank you for telling me," Stephen said stiffly. Adam cleared his throat. "For what it's worth, son, your mother and I don't see much of Carmen these days. Not since we found out she lied about the money." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "She admitted it?" "Not in so many words," Monica said. "But when we pressed her, she remembered that she might have spent some of the cash herself before we visited. By then it was too late. You were gone." Her voice cracked on the last word. Stephen absorbed this information, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and lingering bitterness. "I appreciate you telling me," he said finally, "and for not giving her my information. I'm not sure I'm ready to see her yet." "That's understandable," Adam said. "After what she put you through, you don't owe her anything." The valet arrived with Stephen's car, a sleek but understated sedan that reflected his preference for quality without ostentation. As he drove his parents back to their hotel, Stephen found himself thinking about Carmen, about forgiveness, about the power of the past to shape the present. He had forgiven his parents, understanding that their actions had come from a place of desperation and fear. Could he extend the same grace to his aunt, whose cruelty had seemed more calculated, more deliberate? It was a question he wasn't ready to answer, not tonight. Tonight was for celebrating the beginning of reconciliation with his parents, for looking forward rather than back. As he bid them good night at the hotel, promising to meet for breakfast before they departed the next day, Stephen felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight he had carried for so long it had become part of him. "Thank you for seeing us," Monica said as they prepared to part, "for giving us this chance." "Thank you for coming," Stephen replied. "It means more than I can say." His father, never one for many words, simply embraced him again. "Proud of you, son," he murmured. "Always have been." As Stephen drove home that night, he reflected on the long, strange journey that had brought him to this point. From a desperate teenager stealing from his aunt's purse to a successful businessman with bakeries across the country. From a son estranged from his family to a man beginning to rebuild those precious bonds. It hadn't been easy. There had been hardships, setbacks, moments of doubt. But there had also been kindness, from Joe and Ellie, from employees who believed in his vision, from Olivia, who loved him despite knowing his flaws. And now, perhaps, there could be healing too. Not just with his parents, but with himself, with the part of him that had never quite believed he deserved his success, that had always feared it would be taken away as suddenly as it had come. As he pulled into the driveway of his home, Stephen made a decision. Tomorrow, after his parents left, he would call Mark and ask for Carmen's number. He wasn't sure what he would say to his aunt, or whether he was ready to forgive her completely. But he would take the first step, just as his parents had done by coming to see him. It was time to close the final chapter of his past, to free himself fully from the burden of old resentments. Only then could he move forward into the future he was building. A future that now, unexpectedly but wonderfully, included his family. The headquarters of Rising Dough Bakeries occupied 3 floors of a sleek office building in downtown Riverdale. What had begun as a single storefront operation had, in the span of 15 years, transformed into a national brand with dozens of locations across 12 states. Linda Pearson had been Stephen Johnson's executive assistant for nearly 5 years. She prided herself on running a tight ship, on anticipating her boss's needs before he voiced them, on protecting his time and energy from unnecessary intrusions. So when the elegantly dressed older woman strode into the office reception area without an appointment, Linda's professional radar immediately activated. "Good morning," she greeted with practiced politeness. "Welcome to Rising Dough. How may I help you?" The woman, mid-60s, expensively coiffed, wearing a designer suit that probably cost more than Linda's monthly salary, surveyed the reception area with an appraising eye. "I'm Carmen Whitman," she announced, as if the name should open doors. "Stephen's aunt. I'm here to see him." Linda consulted her calendar, though she already knew Mr. Johnson had no family visits scheduled that day. "I'm afraid Mr. Johnson isn't in the office yet. He has a meeting across town this morning. Would you like to make an appointment for later this week?" Carmen waved away the suggestion as if it were a bothersome fly. "No need for formalities. I'll wait. Family doesn't need appointments." She settled herself onto one of the reception area's leather sofas, removing her designer sunglasses and tucking them into a handbag that matched her shoes. "Mr. Johnson may be several hours," Linda cautioned. "His calendar is quite full today." "As I said, I'll wait." Carmen's tone made it clear the discussion was over. Linda nodded, retreating to her desk. She sent a discreet text to her boss. "Woman claiming to be your Aunt Carmen here. No appointment. Insisting on waiting for you. Instructions." Stephen's response was immediate. "On my way back from Westside meeting. ETA 2 hours." While Linda busied herself with work, Carmen seemed determined to make herself at home. She rose from the sofa and began to wander the reception area, examining the framed magazine covers and awards that lined the walls. "Such remarkable success," she commented, pausing before a Forbes feature on Rising Dough's expansion strategy. "I always knew Stephen had potential. Even as a child, he showed such promise." Linda murmured a non-committal response, keeping a watchful eye on the visitor. As the morning progressed, Carmen expanded her self-guided tour, drifting down the hallway to peer into conference rooms and offices. Staff members glanced up in curiosity as she passed. "I'm Carmen Whitman, Stephen's aunt," she informed each person she encountered, her voice carrying clearly through the open-plan office. "I practically raised that boy. Always had an entrepreneurial spirit, even as a child. I used to tell my husband, 'That one's going places.' And look at him now. A testament to good family influence, wouldn't you say?" At 1:17 p.m., the elevator doors opened and Stephen Johnson stepped into the reception area. At 32, he cut an impressive figure, tall, confident, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of success without ostentation. There was nothing of the desperate 17-year-old who had fled his hometown with nothing but a backpack and $73 to his name. Carmen, who had returned to the sofa after completing her circuit of the office, rose to her feet. "Stephen, darling, what a wonderful surprise." A flicker of something, pain, anger, resolution, crossed Stephen's face before his expression settled into a mask of polite neutrality. "Aunt Carmen," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Linda mentioned you were waiting for me." "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see my successful nephew," Carmen explained, moving forward as if to embrace him. "Your offices are lovely. So impressive." Stephen stepped back slightly, maintaining a professional distance. "Thank you. Would you like to continue this conversation in my office?" Without waiting for a response, he turned and led the way down the hallway. Linda caught his eye as he passed, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Stephen gave a small shake of his head. "I'll handle this," before continuing to his corner office, Carmen following in his wake. The office reflected Stephen's personality. Tasteful, organized, with subtle touches of warmth in the family photographs on his desk and the painting of the original bakery on the wall. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Riverdale's skyline. "Please, have a seat," Stephen gestured to the visitor's chair as he settled behind his desk. Carmen sat, arranging herself carefully, as if aware she was on stage. "You've done very well for yourself, Stephen. The whole family is buzzing about it. Rising dough bakeries all over the country. Who would have thought?" "Thank you," Stephen said, his tone courteous but reserved. "It's been a long journey." "Indeed it has," Carmen agreed, smiling broadly. "And now look at you, a proper businessman. You know, you get that from your grandfather's side. My father was quite the entrepreneur himself." Stephen leaned back slightly in his chair, studying his aunt with calm, assessing eyes. "What brings you here today, Aunt Carmen?" After 15 years of no contact. Carmen's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Why? To reconnect, of course. Family is family, after all. Now that you've established yourself, I thought perhaps we could put the past behind us." "The past?" Stephen repeated, the words hanging between them like a physical presence. "Water under the bridge," Carmen said with a dismissive wave. "Childish misunderstandings. No need to dwell on ancient history." Stephen was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "You accused me of stealing $800 from your purse." Carmen shifted uncomfortably. "I may have been hasty in my judgment." "I only took $100, Stephen said quietly. "Not 800. 100, to buy my little brother a toy he wanted. What I did was wrong, and I've made my peace with that. But your lie, because it was a lie, wasn't it, Aunt Carmen?" Carmen paled, her carefully applied makeup suddenly stark against her skin. I may have been mistaken about the amount." "Mistaken," Stephen echoed, the word devoid of emotion. "A convenient mistake that allowed you to feel superior, to reinforce your belief that the poor side of the family was morally deficient as well as financially disadvantaged." "That's not fair," Carmen protested weakly. "No," Stephen agreed. "It wasn't fair at all." He stood, moving to the window to gaze out at the city below. When he turned back to face his aunt, his expression had softened slightly. "I didn't invite you here today, Aunt Carmen, but since you've come, I'd like to say something I've thought about for a long time. Carmen nodded mutely, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. I forgive you, Stephen said simply. Carmen blinked in surprise. You… what? I forgive you, Stephen repeated. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry the weight of resentment anymore. That night changed the course of my life in ways that ultimately led me here, to this office, to the man I've become. I can't regret that journey, even if I wish it had begun differently. Tears welled in Carmen's eyes. Stephen, I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Stephen replied, but I would ask that you consider something. Of course, Carmen whispered. The wealth you inherited from grandfather that was meant to be shared among all his children, including my mother, did it make you happy? Did it give you the security and satisfaction you sought? Carmen looked down at her manicured hands, now twisting nervously in her lap. I suppose not. Not really. I thought as much, Stephen said gently. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or properties, Aunt Carmen. It's measured in connections, in relationships, in the lives we touch and the good we do. By that measure, I suspect you may not be as wealthy as you appear. A single tear slipped down Carmen's cheek, leaving a track through her perfect makeup. You've become quite the philosopher, she said, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just a baker who's had time to think, Stephen responded. He moved to his desk and pressed the intercom. Linda, could you come in, please? His assistant appeared moments later. Yes, Mr. Johnson. My aunt is leaving now, Stephen said. Would you please show her out, and then reschedule my 2 o'clock for tomorrow? Of course, Linda replied, holding the door open expectantly. Carmen rose shakily to her feet. Stephen, I'm sorry. Truly. Stephen nodded, acknowledging her words without confirming whether he believed them. One last thing, Aunt Carmen. Yes, she asked, pausing at the doorway. The things we do, the kindnesses and the cruelties alike, they ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. Remember that the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their bank account rather than their character. Carmen's face crumpled slightly, the armor of privilege and self-righteousness she had worn for decades finally showing its cracks. Without another word, she followed Linda from the office. Stephen remained standing for several minutes after she left, feeling a profound sense of closure. The confrontation he had imagined, rehearsed, dreaded for years had finally happened. Not on his terms, but perhaps on the right ones. He picked up the framed photograph on his desk, himself with Mark and Ethan at Mark's college graduation, their arms around each other, faces alight with shared joy. Next to it stood another frame, Stephen with his parents at the opening of the 20th Rising Doe location, his mother cutting the ribbon, his father looking on with undisguised pride. Family, lost and found again, broken and mended. 5 years later, Stephen stood in the kitchen of the original Rising Doe bakery, watching his 3-year-old daughter, Ellie, named for the woman who had given him his start, carefully pressing her tiny handprint into a ball of dough under her grandmother's watchful eye. Like this, Nana? The little girl asked, her face scrunched in concentration. Just like that, sweetheart, Monica encouraged. You're a natural baker, just like your daddy. Stephen smiled at the scene, his mother and daughter, flour dusting their matching aprons, bonding over the simple joy of creating something with their hands. It was a picture he couldn't have imagined 15 years ago when he'd believed his relationship with his family was broken beyond repair. Rising Doe had continued to flourish. There were now over 100 locations across the United States and Canada, with the first European branches opening in London and Paris. But despite the company's growth, Stephen had remained true to the values Joe and Ellie had instilled in him: quality over quantity, community over profit, people over bottom lines. Joe had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years earlier, Ellie following just 3 months later. They had lived to see the birth of Stephen's daughter and had delighted in their role as honorary grandparents. Their passing had left a hole in Stephen's heart, but their legacy lived on. In the bakeries that bore their influence, in the charitable foundation Stephen had established in their names to help young people learn culinary trades, and in the values they had passed on to him. Adam entered the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. He had retired from mechanic work 2 years ago and now spent his time restoring classic cars as a hobby, a passion project Stephen had helped him establish by providing the initial workshop space. "Car's all set for the picnic tomorrow," he announced. "Oil changed, tyres checked, good to go." "Thanks, Dad," Stephen said. "Olivia will be glad to hear it. She's been looking forward to this family outing for weeks." The annual family picnic had become a tradition, bringing together the growing Johnson clan and their extended family of choice. Mark and his wife would be there with their new baby. Ethan, now in his medical residency, would attend with his longtime boyfriend. Carmen, mellowed with age and genuine efforts to make amends, would join them with homemade preserves and stories that made the younger generation giggle. "Daddy, look!" Little Ellie held up her dough creation proudly. "I made bread." "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Stephen praised, kneeling to her level. "Should we bake it so you can take it home to show Mommy?" Ellie nodded enthusiastically, her dark curls bouncing. "And baby brother too." Stephen exchanged a smile with his mother over his daughter's head. Olivia was 5 months pregnant with their second child, a boy they planned to name Joseph, continuing the circle of honor and remembrance that had become so important to their family. Later, as they closed up the bakery, Stephen paused at the framed newspaper article that hung near the register, the very article that had led Mark to find him all those years ago. Beside it now hung other milestones: Rising Dough's feature in a national business magazine, a photograph of Stephen with Joe and Ellie at the opening of the 10th location, a picture of the entire extended family at Stephen and Olivia's wedding. A visual reminder of how far he had come, of the journey that had begun with a desperate act and led through hardship and grace to a life richer than he could have imagined. "Ready to go, son?" Adam asked, holding little Ellie's hand. "Ready," Stephen confirmed, turning away from the wall of memories to embrace the present. As they stepped out into the golden afternoon light, Stephen felt the familiar sense of gratitude that had become his constant companion. For the bakery that had saved him, for the family that had forgiven him, for the second chances that had shaped his life, and for the understanding that sometimes the most painful falls can lead to the most remarkable rises.